Standing in that quiet kitchen was a young woman named Claire. She never raised her voice. She never demanded respect. She never reminded anyone of documents hidden inside a lawyer's office. While the woman across the counter believed she was establishing control over the household, Claire was thinking about something entirely different. She was remembering the promise she had made to her father years earlier, a promise she had never expected to keep under circumstances like these. The woman demanding rent was her stepmother, Linda. She had married Claire's father nearly 15 years earlier, long after Claire's mother had passed away following a long illness. For years they had managed an uneasy peace. They were never especially close, but they were rarely openly hostile either. Friends and neighbors assumed they were simply another blended American family learning to coexist. No one outside the house knew how many conversations ended in silence or how many small remarks slowly chipped away at the bond they might have shared. The tension had never exploded into open conflict because Claire's father always found a way to calm every disagreement before it reached its breaking point. Now he was gone, and with him disappeared the only person who knew the full truth about the house they were all living in. When Linda pushed the rental agreement across the counter, she expected resistance. She expected arguments about fairness, accusations of selfishness, perhaps even tears. Instead, Claire reached for the pen without hesitation. She read every page carefully. She paused over each paragraph. She noticed every clause that described the responsibilities of a tenant. She even asked one question that caught Linda by surprise. "Would you like me to pay by check every month?" Linda smiled proudly. She thought the question meant Claire had accepted defeat. "Yes," she answered confidently. "Paper checks. I want records of every payment." Claire nodded once. "That's fine." Looking back, those few seconds became one of the most expensive conversations Linda would ever have. She believed she was creating evidence that proved she controlled the property. In reality, she was unknowingly creating something else entirely. Every signature, every payment, every receipt would eventually tell a very different story, one she never imagined a judge would someday examine line by line. To understand why Claire remained so calm, we have to return nearly 20 years before that rental agreement ever appeared. Long before Linda entered the family, Claire's grandparents had built the house with their own hands on a quiet suburban street outside a growing American city. Her grandfather worked as a licensed electrician. Her grandmother managed a small neighborhood bakery that eventually became well known throughout the community. They were not celebrities or wealthy investors, but they believed deeply in leaving something meaningful for the next generation. Instead of viewing the home as simply another piece of property, they saw it as the family's anchor, a place where birthdays would be celebrated, grandchildren would grow up, and traditions would continue long after they were gone. As they grew older, they also became practical. They watched friends lose homes because of remarriages, expensive court battles, and estate disputes that consumed entire families. Determined to prevent that from happening to their own children, they met with an estate attorney who suggested something many Americans are becoming increasingly familiar with today, placing the property into a family trust rather than leaving it to pass through probate after death. The decision changed everything, although almost no one outside the attorney's office understood its importance. The trust named Claire as the future legal owner while granting her father the right to live in the house for the remainder of his life. It was an arrangement specifically designed to preserve the property regardless of what happened in the future. If her father remarried, the house would remain protected. If creditors appeared, the trust created additional safeguards. If disagreements arose after his death, ownership would already be clearly established. Claire was still young when these documents were signed. She barely understood the legal language filling dozens of pages. What she did remember was her grandmother gently placing a hand over hers and saying, "One day this house will protect you the same way we've tried to protect this family." At the time, those words sounded sentimental. Years later, they would become unforgettable. Claire's father understood exactly why his parents had structured the trust the way they did, but he rarely spoke about it. He never wanted his daughter to carry the burden of believing she owned the family home while he was still alive. To him, it would always be his parents' house, then the place where he raised his only child, and finally the place where he hoped his grandchildren might one day run through the same hallway that Claire had raced down as a little girl. After Claire's mother passed away, the silence inside those walls became almost unbearable. Every room held a memory. Every holiday reminded them of someone missing from the dinner table. Friends encouraged him to sell the property and start over somewhere else, but he refused. He often said that a home wasn't valuable because of the wood, the bricks, or the land beneath it. It was valuable because of the lives built inside it. Claire never forgot hearing him say those words. They became part of the way she viewed family, loyalty, and responsibility. Years later, when she was forced to make impossible decisions about the house, those conversations echoed louder than ever before. About 4 years after losing his wife, Claire's father met Linda through mutual friends at a community fundraising event. Linda was charming, outgoing, and seemed to bring laughter back into a man who had spent years carrying quiet sadness. Claire genuinely wanted her father to be happy. She welcomed Linda into their lives with cautious optimism, believing another chance at companionship was something her father deserved. During the first year of their marriage, everything appeared normal. Linda helped decorate the house during the holidays, hosted neighborhood gatherings, and often spoke proudly about creating a blended family. Neighbors admired how quickly she seemed to fit into the household. Even Claire believed the difficult chapter of their lives had finally ended. But time has a way of revealing sides of people that first impressions never show. The warmth that everyone admired in public slowly began disappearing behind closed doors, replaced by subtle comments that were easy to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore when they accumulated over months and years. It started with little things. Linda would casually refer to Claire as a guest whenever friends visited, despite the fact that Claire had lived there since birth. Family photographs featuring Claire's late mother gradually disappeared from the living room shelves, replaced by newer portraits that made it seem as though the family's history had begun only after Linda arrived. When Claire questioned where the old photographs had gone, Linda smiled politely and claimed she was simply modernizing the decor. Claire chose not to argue. She quietly collected the pictures and placed them safely in boxes upstairs. Her father noticed what had happened, and later that evening he apologized, explaining that he would put everything back where it belonged. Claire stopped him. She didn't want another argument. She told him it wasn't worth creating tension over picture frames. But deep inside, she understood the issue had never been about photographs. It was about slowly rewriting the story of who belonged in that house and who didn't. As the years passed, Linda became increasingly comfortable making decisions without discussing them with anyone else. Furniture that had belonged to Claire's grandparents suddenly appeared at charity donation centers. Old handwritten recipes from Claire's grandmother disappeared from kitchen drawers. Even sentimental items stored in the attic quietly vanished. Whenever Claire asked about them, Linda always had an explanation. They were old. Nobody used them anymore. I thought I was helping. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but together they painted a troubling picture. Claire's father often replaced what he could recover, but not everything could be found once it left the house. More than once, he privately assured Claire that one day everything would make sense. He would often say, "Some things are better protected by patience than by arguments." Claire didn't fully understand what he meant, but she trusted him completely. Unknown to Linda, he was making regular visits to the family's attorney, reviewing trust documents and ensuring every legal protection remained exactly as his parents had intended. The attorney, a respected estate lawyer named Daniel Harper, had represented Claire's family for decades. He had helped her grandparents establish the trust, advised her father after her mother's passing, and understood every detail of the property's legal history. During one of their private meetings, Claire's father asked a question that revealed just how concerned he had become. "If something happens to me unexpectedly, how quickly could Claire prove ownership?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Immediately, provided she follows the instructions we've already discussed." Her father leaned back quietly and nodded. He wasn't worried about Claire's ability to handle responsibility. He was worried about how other people might react once he was gone. Daniel reminded him that legal ownership wasn't determined by assumptions or emotions. It was determined by recorded documents, properly executed trusts, and state property law. Those words brought him comfort, though he hoped Claire would never need to rely on them. Despite his concerns, Claire's father never treated Linda as an enemy. He continued trying to preserve peace inside the family. Holidays were celebrated together. Birthdays were acknowledged. Vacations were planned. To outsiders, they appeared to be a perfectly ordinary American family navigating the usual challenges of blended households. Even Claire sometimes questioned whether she had been imagining the growing distance between herself and Linda. Then small incidents would remind her otherwise. Linda increasingly referred to the home as my house whenever disagreements arose. At first, Claire ignored the wording. After all, married couples often spoke that way. But eventually the phrase became more pointed. As long as you're living in my house. These are my rules. My home deserves respect. Each time Claire heard those words, she remembered the trust documents locked safely inside Daniel Harper's office. She never corrected Linda. She simply listened, wondering whether her father noticed the same pattern. He did notice, although he rarely responded in the moment. One quiet evening after dinner, while Linda was visiting a friend across town, he invited Claire to sit with him on the back porch. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard where Claire had played as a child. Without looking directly at her, he asked, "Do you remember what your grandmother used to say about this house?" Claire smiled softly. "She said it would protect our family." He nodded. "Exactly. Promise me something." Claire looked at him, immediately sensing the seriousness in his voice. "Whatever happens after I'm gone, don't let anger make your decisions. Let the truth do the work." People often reveal themselves when they believe nobody can challenge them. If that day ever comes, stay patient. The law doesn't need loud voices. It only needs facts. Claire promised she would remember. Neither of them realized that conversation would become one of the last truly peaceful moments they would ever share inside the house that had shaped all of their lives. The months that followed seemed almost ordinary, which is often how life's biggest turning points arrive. There was no dramatic warning, no final speech that everyone recognized as a goodbye. Claire's father continued working fewer hours at the construction company he had spent decades helping build. He enjoyed tending to the small vegetable garden behind the house, reading history books in the evenings, and calling Claire every afternoon just to ask how her day was going. Linda appeared content as well, at least on the surface. She often talked about future renovations, mentioning that the kitchen could use modern cabinets or that the guest bedroom should become a hobby room. Claire noticed how naturally Linda discussed permanent changes, as though the future of the house had already been decided. Her father usually responded with a polite smile before changing the subject. Looking back, Claire realized he never once promised that those renovations would actually happen. He simply allowed Linda to believe whatever she wanted to believe, perhaps hoping reality would never have to interrupt the fragile peace they had managed to maintain. Then, without warning, everything changed. One cold autumn morning, Claire received a phone call that instantly divided her life into two parts, everything before that moment and everything after it. Her father had suffered a massive heart attack while driving home from a routine doctor's appointment. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. By the time Claire reached the hospital, the man who had been her greatest source of stability was gone. The loss settled over her with a weight she could barely describe. She wasn't just mourning her father. She was mourning the last person who had quietly held the family together through patience, wisdom, and sacrifice. Standing outside the hospital that afternoon, she remembered his words from the porch only weeks earlier. "Don't let anger make your decisions, let the truth do the work." At the time, they had sounded like thoughtful advice from a loving parent. Now they felt almost like instructions left behind for a future he somehow sensed was coming. The funeral drew relatives, old co-workers, neighbors, and lifelong friends. Story after story painted the same picture of the man Claire had always known, dependable, generous, and unwilling to seek recognition for the good he did. Many people spoke about the homes he had helped build, the families he had quietly supported during difficult times, and the countless acts of kindness he never mentioned to anyone. Linda stood beside the casket greeting mourners, accepting condolences with remarkable composure. To everyone watching, she appeared to be the grieving widow carrying the unbearable weight of losing her husband. Claire never questioned her grief. Whatever disagreements existed inside the family, she believed Linda had genuinely loved her father in her own way. For those few hours, nothing else seemed to matter. Ownership, inheritance, legal documents, and family tension faded into the background. There was only loss. There was only a daughter saying goodbye to the man who had shaped every chapter of her life. After the funeral, relatives slowly returned to their own lives. The flowers began to wilt. Sympathy cards stopped arriving. Phone calls became less frequent. Like so many families after a death, they discovered that grief continues long after everyone else assumes healing has begun. Claire remained in the house, helping organize paperwork, cancel subscriptions, and sort through the endless responsibilities that follow the passing of a loved one. During those first few days, Linda seemed unusually quiet. She spent hours inside the master bedroom reviewing financial papers and insurance documents. Claire assumed she was simply trying to understand their financial situation. She offered help several times, but Linda politely declined, insisting she could manage everything herself. It wasn't until the end of the first week that Claire noticed something had shifted. Linda's tone had changed. The sadness that had filled the house was slowly being replaced by something colder, something more calculating. Conversations became shorter. Doors closed more often. The warmth that remained after the funeral began disappearing one small moment at a time. One evening, Claire returned home after meeting Daniel Harper to review the trust documents her father had mentioned so many times. The meeting itself had been emotional. Daniel expressed sincere condolences before carefully explaining every legal protection Claire's grandparents had established decades earlier. He showed her certified copies of the trust, the recorded deed, and every amendment that had been properly filed over the years. There was no uncertainty. Under the law, Claire had become the full legal owner of the property the moment her father's life estate ended. Daniel advised her not to make any immediate decisions while emotions were still raw. Grief has a way of pushing people toward actions they'll regret, he said calmly. Give everyone time. Observe. Listen. If questions arise, we'll answer them with facts, not emotion. Claire appreciated the advice. She had no desire to force anyone out of the home. She simply wanted time to mourn her father in peace. She believed Linda would eventually learn the truth through the proper legal process, and together they could discuss what came next with dignity. But while Claire was quietly preparing to honor her father's wishes, Linda was reaching very different conclusions. Without consulting Daniel, without requesting copies of the trust, and without asking a single question about the property's legal status, she began behaving as though ownership had transferred automatically to her. She contacted utility companies to place accounts solely in her name. She introduced herself to neighbors as the homeowner now. She even began discussing plans to remodel portions of the property before the year was over. None of those actions actually changed who legally owned the house, but they revealed something important about Linda's state of mind. She wasn't seeking clarity. She had already convinced herself she possessed absolute authority. Assumptions had replaced facts, and confidence had replaced caution. Claire noticed every change but remembered her father's final advice. She stayed silent. She continued helping around the house exactly as before, waiting to see whether Linda would eventually seek the truth for herself. She never did. Instead, just 7 days after the funeral, Linda called Claire into the kitchen and placed a sealed envelope on the counter. Inside was a document that would set the entire course of what happened next. Linda folded her hands together as Claire picked up the envelope. There was no hesitation in her posture and no uncertainty in her expression. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed every important decision had already been made. Claire carefully opened the envelope, expecting perhaps a list of household expenses or a discussion about how they would manage the home together while everyone adjusted to life without her father. Instead, she unfolded several neatly printed pages bearing the title Residential Lease Agreement. For a brief moment, she wondered if there had been some kind of mistake. She read the first paragraph once, then again, making sure she hadn't misunderstood. According to the document, she was now being offered the opportunity to remain in the house as a tenant. The monthly rent would be $1,000. A security deposit would also be required, along with late payment penalties, maintenance responsibilities, and strict occupancy rules. Every sentence assumed one thing without question, that Linda was the lawful owner of the property. Claire slowly lifted her eyes from the paperwork and looked across the kitchen. Linda wasn't smiling anymore. She was waiting, almost studying Claire's face, expecting disappointment, perhaps even outrage. Instead, Claire remained completely composed. Linda finally broke the silence. She explained that life had changed now that Claire's father was gone. Bills still had to be paid, property upkeep would continue, and everyone living under the same roof needed to contribute. She insisted the arrangement was reasonable, pointing out that comparable homes in the neighborhood rented for much more than $1,000 each month. She even described the lease as generous, telling Claire she was offering family consideration that an ordinary landlord never would. As she spoke, she sounded less like a grieving widow and more like a businesswoman presenting terms to a prospective tenant. Claire listened without interrupting. She noticed how often Linda referred to the property as my home and my investment. Not once did she mention reviewing the estate with an attorney. Not once did she ask whether there might be documents she hadn't yet seen. Everything she said rested on confidence rather than confirmation. Claire thought back to Daniel Harper's advice only a few days earlier. Observe. Listen. Let facts speak when the time comes. She realized that moment had not yet arrived. Quietly, Claire continued reading every page of the lease. She wasn't searching for reasons to refuse it. She was paying attention to details most people overlook during emotional moments. Linda had signed the agreement as the property's owner. Her signature appeared beneath language affirming that she possessed full legal authority to lease the residence. Every clause had been drafted as though ownership was beyond dispute. Claire knew enough from her meeting with Daniel to understand the significance of those statements. They weren't merely opinions. They were written representations carrying legal consequences if proven false. Still, she said nothing. She simply reached the final page, picked up the pen resting beside the document, and signed her own name in neat, deliberate handwriting. Linda blinked in surprise. She had prepared herself for resistance, arguments, perhaps even accusations of betrayal. Instead, she received immediate compliance. For the first time since Claire entered the kitchen, Linda looked almost confused. Winning had been easier than she expected, and victories that come too easily often hide consequences no one sees coming. "I'll pay by check each month," Claire said calmly as she returned the paperwork across the counter. "That way we'll both have clear records." Linda's expression brightened immediately. She nodded with satisfaction, believing the suggestion demonstrated acceptance of the new arrangement. "Exactly," she replied. "Paper records protect everyone," Claire agreed with a quiet nod. "They certainly do." Neither woman added another word. Yet those 4 simple sentences would eventually become some of the most important words spoken during the entire dispute. Linda believed she had secured written proof of her authority. Claire understood that every payment would create an equally important record, one establishing exactly how Linda had chosen to present herself and exactly how she expected the legal owner of the property to behave. Sometimes the strongest evidence in a courtroom isn't created by investigators or attorneys. Sometimes it is created voluntarily by people who never imagined their own decisions will one day be examined under oath. Life settled into a routine that appeared strangely ordinary. On the first day of each month, Claire wrote a check for $1,000 exactly as promised. Linda deposited every payment without hesitation. Receipts were carefully filed away in a folder she kept inside the dining room cabinet. She often mentioned to friends that collecting rent had helped her remain financially secure after losing her husband. Some praised her for being practical. Others commented that Claire was fortunate to have been allowed to remain in the house at all. Those conversations rarely reached Claire directly, but occasionally neighbors would repeat them during casual conversations. Claire never corrected anyone. She never announced that the property belonged to her. She simply thanked them politely and changed the subject. To outsiders, her silence looked like acceptance. In reality, it was patience. Every passing month strengthened the written record, and every assumption Linda shared with others carried her further away from the truth she had never taken the time to verify. Daniel Harper remained quietly involved throughout this period. Claire met with him occasionally to update him on what had happened inside the house. She brought copies of every rent check, every receipt, and every piece of correspondence Linda provided. Daniel reviewed each document carefully before placing it into an organized file. He never encouraged confrontation. In fact, he repeatedly reminded Claire that the law often favors people who remain measured while others act impulsively. "You don't need to convince Linda," he told her during one meeting. "Documents have a way of speaking more clearly than arguments ever could." Claire appreciated his steady guidance. She still hoped there might be an opportunity for an honest conversation before matters became irreversible. She had no desire to embarrass Linda or force unnecessary conflict. But with each passing week, Linda's confidence continued growing. She no longer behaved like someone uncertain about the future. She behaved like someone who believed the house, and everything inside it, was unquestionably hers, never realizing that one routine decision she was about to make would uncover a truth she could no longer ignore. Months passed, and the arrangement became so routine that even Claire occasionally found herself forgetting how unusual the situation really was. Every first of the month, she placed another check for exactly $1,000 inside an envelope and left it on the kitchen counter before leaving for work. Every afternoon, she returned home to find the envelope gone, the payment deposited, and another month quietly added to the growing paper trail Daniel Harper carefully maintained inside his office. Linda never missed an opportunity to remind Claire of her responsibilities. If the lawn needed mowing, she would casually mention that tenants should help maintain the property. If a faucet leaked or a light fixture stopped working, she expected Claire to contribute because, as she often put it, that's part of living under someone else's roof. Claire simply nodded and took care of whatever needed attention. She never complained, not because she believed Linda was right, but because she understood something Linda didn't. Every improvement she made increased the value of a home she already legally owned. While Linda believed she was protecting her investment, Claire was quietly preserving her own inheritance. Neighbors gradually accepted Linda's version of events without question. At neighborhood gatherings, she spoke confidently about my property and my plans for the future. She mentioned replacing the aging roof within the next few years and dreamed aloud about adding a sunroom overlooking the backyard. Friends complimented her determination after losing her husband, praising her strength for taking control of the household during such a difficult period. Claire often stood nearby listening without correcting anyone. She realized something important during those conversations. Most people never intentionally believe false information. They simply trust the person who sounds the most certain. Linda never presented her assumptions as possibilities. She stated them as facts. And because no one challenged her, those assumptions slowly became accepted as reality throughout the neighborhood. Claire wasn't angry about it. She understood that the truth doesn't become less true simply because more people believe something else. Facts remain facts, even when they stand alone. One Saturday afternoon, Linda invited several friends over for lunch. Claire planned to spend the day organizing boxes in the garage, hoping to sort through some of her father's old tools and personal belongings. As she carried another box toward the workbench, voices drifted through the open kitchen window. She hadn't intended to listen, but one sentence immediately caught her attention. Linda laughed and said, "Honestly, charging rent was the best decision I ever made. She finally understands that this is my house now." The guests laughed politely. One woman asked whether Claire had considered moving out instead. Linda shrugged confidently. "She doesn't have many options. Rental prices around here are much higher than what I'm charging. She knows she's getting a good deal." Claire paused for only a moment before continuing her work. The words stung, but they also confirmed something Daniel had mentioned months earlier. People often reveal their true beliefs when they think no one is paying attention. Linda genuinely believed she held complete authority, and that belief influenced every decision she made. Later that evening, Claire drove to Daniel Harper's office for one of their scheduled meetings. She handed him copies of the latest rent checks and quietly repeated the conversation she had overheard through the kitchen window. Daniel listened carefully before closing the file in front of him. "Confidence can be a dangerous thing," he said thoughtfully. "Especially when it isn't supported by documentation." Claire looked at him for a moment before asking the question that had weighed on her mind for weeks. "Should I tell her?" Daniel remained silent for several seconds before answering. "That decision belongs to you. But remember what your father wanted. He hoped the truth would reveal itself naturally, not through confrontation. Sometimes people only accept reality when they discover it for themselves." Claire nodded slowly. She wasn't interested in humiliating Linda. She simply wanted peace. If an honest conversation could still happen, she hoped it would. Unfortunately, events were already moving in another direction. Only a few weeks later, Linda made a decision she believed would secure her financial future. She had been discussing renovations for months, and now she intended to move forward with them. Rising property values throughout the neighborhood convinced her that borrowing against the home's equity would be the easiest way to finance an extensive remodeling project. She imagined a brand new kitchen with marble countertops, updated bathrooms, fresh landscaping, and perhaps even the sunroom she had described so enthusiastically to her friends. Certain that the house belonged to her, she gathered what she believed were the necessary documents and scheduled an appointment with the local bank. She dressed carefully that morning, carrying herself with the same confidence she displayed whenever discussing the property. Before leaving, she casually mentioned to Claire that she had important homeowner business to handle. Claire wished her a good day without asking any questions. Once the front door closed, she found herself remembering Daniel's words. Sometimes the truth reveals itself without anyone needing to force it. The bank representative greeted Linda warmly and invited her into a private office. At first, everything proceeded exactly as she expected. Basic information was collected. Financial statements were reviewed. Income was discussed. Then came the routine step that no one considered unusual. The loan officer entered the property's address into the county records database to verify ownership before discussing financing options. His expression changed almost immediately. He typed again, believing he might have entered the address incorrectly. After checking the screen a second time, he looked back at Linda with polite confusion. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said carefully, "I may need a moment to clarify something." Linda smiled confidently. "Of course." The loan officer hesitated before continuing. "According to the county's recorded property records, the legal owner listed for this residence isn't you." Linda laughed softly, assuming there had been some administrative error. "That can't be right," she replied. "I've lived there for years. My husband owned the house." The loan officer turned the monitor slightly so she could read the official record herself. There, displayed in plain black letters, was a single name she never expected to see. Claire's. In that instant, every assumption Linda had built over the past several months began collapsing, and she still had no idea that what she had just discovered was only the beginning of a much larger revelation. For several long seconds, Linda simply stared at the screen without speaking. She blinked once, then leaned closer as though the words might somehow rearrange themselves if she looked carefully enough. They didn't. The address was correct. The legal description matched the property perfectly. Every line referred to the home she had confidently called her own for months. Yet beside the section labeled current owner, there was only one name. Claire. No mention of her late husband. No mention of Linda. No indication that she possessed any ownership interest whatsoever. The loan officer watched her expression change from confidence to confusion and finally to disbelief. He had seen similar reactions before. Estate disputes, inheritance misunderstandings, and title complications were more common than many people realized. Remaining professional, he gently explained that banks rely on county records and recorded deeds, not assumptions or family history. If the public records identified someone else as the legal owner, there was nothing he could do until the title issue was resolved. Linda forced a smile, thanked him for his time, gathered her papers with trembling hands, and walked out of the office trying to convince herself there had to be some clerical mistake. The drive home felt much longer than usual. Questions crowded her mind faster than she could answer them. How could Claire's name appear on the property? Why had her husband never mentioned anything about a trust? Why hadn't the attorney contacted her immediately after the funeral if ownership had already been decided? The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. Instead of questioning whether she had misunderstood the situation from the beginning, she convinced herself that someone else had made a serious administrative error. Surely the county had outdated records. Perhaps the deed had never been updated after her husband's death. Maybe the bank employee had accessed the wrong file altogether. By the time she pulled into the driveway, uncertainty had slowly transformed into determination. She wasn't going to accept what she had seen until she heard an explanation directly from the county offices. If there was a mistake, she intended to have it corrected immediately. The following morning, Linda arrived at the county recorder's office shortly after it opened. She waited impatiently while several people ahead of her completed routine transactions involving deeds, mortgages, and property transfers. When her turn finally arrived, she provided the address and requested a certified copy of the property's ownership records. The clerk entered the information into the system before disappearing into a back office. A few minutes later, she returned carrying several official documents bearing the county seal. Linda accepted the paperwork confidently, believing these certified copies would prove the bank had been wrong. Instead, the first page confirmed exactly what she had seen the previous day. Years earlier, Claire's grandparents had transferred the property into a family trust. The trust granted Claire's father the legal right to live in the home for the remainder of his life, but full ownership had already been designated for Claire upon the termination of that life estate. Every document had been properly signed, witnessed, notarized, and recorded. The transfer wasn't recent. It had existed for years, quietly sitting inside the public record where anyone could have discovered it with a simple title search. Linda's hands tightened around the documents as another realization struck her with even greater force. She had never performed that title search. Not after marrying Claire's father. Not after moving into the house. Not after his death. She had assumed ownership transferred automatically because she was the surviving spouse. She had never considered the possibility that legal ownership and occupancy could be entirely different matters. The clerk, noticing her silence, politely asked if there was anything else she needed. Linda hesitated before asking whether the records might be incomplete. The clerk shook her head gently. "These are the official recorded documents for the property," she explained. "If changes are ever made, they'll appear here after they're legally filed. As of today, this is the current ownership record." Linda thanked her mechanically before leaving the building, clutching the certified copy so tightly that the edges began to bend. The truth she had spent months unknowingly avoiding was now impossible to ignore. Back inside Daniel Harper's office that same afternoon, Claire sat quietly reviewing correspondence related to her father's estate. Daniel looked up as his assistant entered with a message. "Linda called," she said. "She requested an urgent appointment." Daniel exchanged a brief glance with Claire before thanking his assistant and asking her to schedule the meeting for the following morning. Once the door closed, neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Claire asked the question she had been expecting for months. "She knows now, doesn't she?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I believe she does." Claire lowered her eyes to the table. There was no satisfaction in her expression. She hadn't spent the past several months waiting for Linda to feel embarrassed. She had hoped the truth might eventually open the door to an honest conversation, one built on facts instead of assumptions. Daniel studied her carefully before speaking. "Remember what your father wanted. Stay calm. Let the documents speak for themselves. No matter what happens tomorrow, don't let emotion replace judgment." Claire quietly agreed. She knew the meeting ahead could change everything. That night, the atmosphere inside the house felt noticeably different. Linda returned home unusually late, carrying the same folder of certified documents she had collected from the county recorder's office. She barely acknowledged Claire before disappearing into the master bedroom and closing the door. Hours passed without either of them saying a word. Claire remained in the living room reading one of her father's old history books, though she found herself turning the same page repeatedly without absorbing a single sentence. She knew Linda was likely rereading every document, searching for some overlooked detail that might restore the version of reality she had believed for so long. But documents rarely change because someone wishes they would. They remain exactly as they were signed, recorded, and preserved. Late that evening, Claire heard footsteps outside her bedroom door. They stopped briefly, as though someone had considered knocking. Then they quietly retreated down the hallway. Whatever Linda wanted to say, she wasn't ready to say it yet. Morning arrived carrying a silence neither woman could ignore. Linda left early for her appointment with Daniel Harper, convinced there had to be an explanation that somehow favored her. She rehearsed dozens of arguments during the drive. She had been married to Claire's father for years. She had helped maintain the property. She had paid utility bills and household expenses. Surely those contributions counted for something. Yet beneath every argument lay a troubling fact she couldn't escape. She had never actually verified ownership before acting as though she possessed it. She had never consulted the trust. She had never asked Daniel to explain the estate before presenting Claire with the lease agreement and collecting rent month after month. As she parked outside the attorney's office, she took one long breath before stepping out of the car. She still believed she could somehow fix the situation. She had no idea that Daniel Harper had already assembled every lease, every canceled check, every receipt, every written communication, and every recorded document into a single file waiting on the conference table. Before another word was spoken, that file would begin telling a story far different from the one Linda had been telling herself for months. Linda paused outside Daniel Harper's office door with her hand resting on the polished brass handle. Through the frosted glass she could see only vague silhouettes moving inside, but her imagination filled in the details she couldn't see. She pictured stacks of paperwork proving there had been some misunderstanding, perhaps an unsigned document or an outdated filing that would explain everything. She had spent the entire night convincing herself that no family could live together for so many years without someone eventually mentioning that the house belonged to someone else. Surely her husband would have told her. Surely Claire would have said something. Surely an attorney would have contacted her before allowing months to pass. Those assumptions gave her just enough confidence to open the door. Daniel stood as she entered, greeting her with the same calm professionalism he had shown every member of Claire's family for decades. He offered his condolences once again for the loss of her husband before inviting her to sit. Claire wasn't there. Daniel had intentionally scheduled the meeting that way. He wanted the conversation to remain focused on facts rather than emotions. For several moments neither of them mentioned the house. Daniel asked how she had been coping since the funeral and whether she had support from friends or relatives. Linda answered politely but impatiently. She hadn't driven across town to discuss grief. Finally, she removed the certified property records from her folder and placed them on the conference table. "I went to the bank yesterday," she began. "They told me I wasn't the owner of my home. Then I went to the county recorder's office, and they gave me these. There has to be some mistake." Daniel looked down at the documents without surprise. He recognized every page immediately because his own signature appeared on several of them from years earlier. He folded his hands together before speaking carefully. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand why this is upsetting. But I can assure you there isn't a recording error. Those documents accurately reflect the legal ownership of the property." Linda frowned. "Then explain how this happened." Daniel nodded gently. "I'd be happy to." He opened a thick file that had remained closed in front of him since the meeting began. Inside were copies of documents dating back nearly 2 decades. He began with the trust created by Claire's grandparents, explaining why they had chosen that structure instead of relying solely on a traditional will. He described how Claire's father had been granted a life estate, allowing him to occupy the home for the remainder of his life while preserving ownership for Claire. He carefully pointed to the relevant paragraphs, encouraging Linda to read each one herself rather than simply accepting his explanation. There was no dramatic reveal because the documents spoke with remarkable clarity. Every signature had been witnessed. Every page had been notarized. Every filing had been properly recorded with the county long before Linda married Claire's father. Daniel wasn't presenting new evidence. He was simply walking Linda through legal facts that had existed quietly for years. Linda turned each page more slowly than the last. Her expression shifted from disbelief to quiet resignation as the reality became impossible to deny. "My husband knew about all of this?" she asked softly. Daniel answered truthfully. "Yes. He understood every part of the trust because he helped administer it after Claire's grandparents passed away." Linda looked away toward the office window. "Why didn't he tell me?" Daniel remained silent for a moment before choosing his words carefully. "I can't fully answer that because only he knew everything he was thinking. But I can tell you he loved peace inside his family. He often hoped difficult conversations could be avoided if they weren't absolutely necessary." Linda lowered her eyes. For the first time since entering the office, her confidence seemed to disappear completely. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked hurt, confused, and deeply unsettled by the realization that the man she had shared her life with had carried such an important responsibility without ever discussing it. Daniel reached for another section of the file. "There is one more matter we should discuss." Linda looked back at him uncertainly. He removed the lease agreement she had presented to Claire shortly after the funeral, placing it beside the trust documents. Then he laid several canceled checks across the table, each showing a payment of $1,000 made by Claire and deposited by Linda over the previous months. "Do you recognize these?" he asked. Linda nodded slowly. "Those are the rent payments." Daniel inclined his head. "Yes. According to this lease, you represented yourself as the lawful owner of the property and entered into a landlord-tenant relationship with the person who was, in fact, the legal owner. Linda immediately tried to explain. I didn't know. Daniel didn't interrupt. He allowed her to finish before responding. I understand that. Intent matters. But so do actions. The question now isn't whether you intended to misrepresent ownership. The question is how both parties move forward from here in a lawful and respectful manner. The room fell silent again. Linda looked at the lease agreement, then at the stack of canceled checks, and finally back to the trust that carried Claire's name. It suddenly occurred to her that every month she had confidently accepted rent from someone who never owed it in the first place. Every receipt she had carefully saved, believing it strengthened her position, now documented something entirely different. She remembered insisting on paper checks because she wanted a permanent record. She remembered telling Claire that records protected everyone. At the time, she had spoken those words with absolute certainty. Now they echoed in her mind with painful irony. Daniel gently closed the file before speaking once more. Claire has not asked me to begin any legal action against you. She has not demanded reimbursement through the courts. She has only asked that this matter be resolved fairly and in accordance with your late husband's wishes. Linda swallowed hard. Until that moment, she had convinced herself Claire had been quietly plotting revenge. Instead, she was learning that Claire had spent months showing a restraint she herself had never shown. Daniel stood and walked toward a cabinet where he retrieved a small sealed envelope bearing Claire's father's handwriting. He returned to the table and carefully placed it in front of Linda. Your husband left this with me several years ago, he said quietly. He instructed me to deliver it only if circumstances made it necessary. Linda looked at the familiar handwriting and felt her throat tighten. For several seconds she couldn't bring herself to touch the envelope. She had spent months believing she understood everything her husband had wanted after his passing. Now she was discovering that perhaps the most important message of all had remained unread. With trembling hands, she slowly broke the seal, completely unaware that the words waiting inside would force her to reconsider not only the house, but every decision she had made since the day she believed it had become hers. Linda unfolded the letter with extraordinary care, almost as though she feared the paper itself might fall apart in her hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every curve of every letter belonged to the man she had shared nearly 15 years of her life with. For a moment, the conference room disappeared around her. She wasn't sitting across from an attorney anymore. She was remembering evenings on the back porch, quiet Sunday mornings over coffee, and the countless ordinary moments that had once seemed insignificant but now felt priceless. Taking a slow breath, she began reading silently. The first lines were simple. Her husband thanked her for the years they had spent together and acknowledged the happiness she had brought back into his life after losing Claire's mother. There was warmth in every sentence. There was kindness. Nothing about the letter sounded angry or accusatory. Then, gradually, the purpose of the letter became clear. He explained that there was one responsibility he had carried from the day his parents established the family trust, a responsibility he could never ignore because it represented a promise he had made to both his parents and his late wife. Protecting the house had never been about choosing one person over another. It had always been about honoring a commitment that existed long before either of them imagined what the future would bring. As Linda continued reading, tears slowly gathered in her eyes. Her husband explained that he had often wanted to discuss the trust openly but had repeatedly postponed the conversation, hoping there would always be another opportunity. Whenever he considered bringing it up, another family gathering, another holiday, or another celebration seemed more important than beginning a discussion that might create unnecessary tension. He admitted that perhaps he had made a mistake by waiting so long. He understood that silence could sometimes protect peace, but it could also leave behind painful misunderstandings after someone was gone. Then came the paragraph that struck Linda harder than anything else in the letter. He wrote that Claire had never viewed the house as a prize or an investment. To her, it represented generations of family history, childhood memories, and promises that stretched back to her grandparents. He asked Linda, if she was ever reading those words, to remember that Claire was not trying to take anything away from anyone. She was simply carrying the responsibility that had been entrusted to her years earlier. Please don't mistake responsibility for selfishness, he wrote. She has always loved this family more than she has loved any piece of property. Linda stopped reading for a moment and covered her face with one hand. Memories she hadn't thought about in years began returning one after another. She remembered the day Claire carefully wrapped her grandmother's old china before placing it into storage because she was afraid it might be damaged. She remembered how protective Claire had always been of family photographs, handwritten recipes, and old holiday decorations. At the time, Linda had dismissed those actions as simple sentimentality. Now she understood they reflected something much deeper. Claire had never been trying to preserve old possessions for their monetary value. She had been preserving her family's history because she already understood that one day she would become responsible for everything those memories represented. Linda realized she had spent years interpreting Claire's quiet nature as weakness, when in reality it had been restraint. That realization settled heavily over her. It wasn't simply that she had misunderstood the legal ownership of the house. She had misunderstood the person standing across from her every day. Daniel remained silent while Linda finished reading. He had delivered many difficult conversations during his career, but experience had taught him that people often needed time to absorb the truth before discussing what came next. Eventually, Linda folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. She knew all along. Daniel nodded. Yes. Linda looked up slowly. She knew she owned the house. And she still paid me every month. She did, Daniel answered calmly. Not because she agreed with the lease, but because she chose to respect your late husband's wish that conflict should never be the first solution. She hoped there would come a time when the truth could be discussed peacefully. Linda stared at the canceled checks spread across the table. Each one suddenly carried a different meaning. They were no longer symbols of authority. They were reminders of patience she had neither recognized nor appreciated. For several minutes, Linda asked question after question, trying to understand why Claire had never confronted her. Daniel answered honestly without embellishment. Claire had considered telling her the truth more than once. She had even asked whether immediate legal action might be appropriate after receiving the lease agreement. Each time, Daniel reminded her of her father's final request. Observe. Stay patient. Let facts speak louder than emotion. Claire followed that advice faithfully, even when neighbors praised Linda as the homeowner and quietly assumed Claire was merely a tenant. She never corrected anyone because she believed humiliating Linda would only deepen wounds that grief had already created. Linda listened without interrupting. The image she had built of Claire over the years no longer fit the evidence in front of her. She had convinced herself Claire was passive because she lacked confidence. Instead, she discovered Claire had remained calm because she possessed something much stronger than confidence. She possessed certainty. When the meeting finally ended, Daniel walked Linda to the door before offering one final piece of advice. There are moments in life when being legally right and morally right point in the same direction, he said quietly. This is one of those moments. Claire has not treated this as a battle. I hope you won't either. Linda nodded without responding. She stepped outside carrying the letter, the certified documents, and a weight she had never anticipated. During the drive home, she passed familiar streets she had traveled hundreds of times before, yet everything looked strangely different. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The houses hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was her understanding of where she truly stood. For months she had looked through the front windows of that home believing she was protecting what belonged to her. Now she realized she had been living inside someone else's inheritance while charging that person rent for the privilege of remaining there. It was a realization that no amount of pride could erase. As Linda pulled into the driveway, she noticed Claire sitting alone on the back porch exactly where her father had so often spent quiet evenings watching the sunset. She was holding one of his old coffee mugs, though it had long since gone cold. Claire looked up as Linda stepped out of the car. Their eyes met across the yard, and for the first time in many months neither of them spoke. There were no accusations waiting to be shouted. No dramatic confrontation. Only two women standing on opposite sides of the same painful truth. Linda took one hesitant step toward the porch before stopping again. She still held the unopened future of their relationship in her hands, along with the letter that had changed everything she believed. She knew an apology was necessary, but she also understood that some wounds cannot be healed by a single conversation. What she didn't know was that Claire had already made one decision of her own, a decision that neither Daniel nor her late father had suggested, and it would determine whether the family still had any chance of rebuilding what had been broken. Claire remained seated on the porch as the evening sun settled behind the rows of maple trees lining the neighborhood. She had always found comfort there. It was the same porch where her father had taught her how to ride a bicycle by first explaining that balance came from looking forward rather than down. It was where they had shared ice cream during summer thunderstorms, celebrated birthdays, and spent countless evenings talking about life after dinner. Every board beneath her feet carried memories that no legal document could ever describe. As Linda slowly approached, Claire looked at her without anger. She noticed the folder tucked beneath Linda's arm and the familiar envelope bearing her father's handwriting. She immediately understood where Linda had been. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that follows the collapse of assumptions, when words no longer arrive as easily as they once did. Linda finally stopped a few feet from the porch steps. Her confident posture had disappeared. The woman who had once stood proudly in the kitchen declaring, "My house, my rules," now looked uncertain about whether she even deserved to walk through the front door. She took a slow breath before speaking. "I know." Claire looked at her quietly. Daniel explained everything. Claire nodded gently but said nothing. Linda's voice began to tremble. "I read your father's letter." Hearing those words immediately softened Claire's expression. She had wondered whether her father had ever left such a letter behind, but Daniel had honored his promise never to discuss it unless circumstances required it. If Linda had read those pages, then Claire knew she had finally heard the truth from the one person whose voice mattered most. Still, Claire waited. She believed apologies should never be interrupted. People deserve the opportunity to speak honestly once they finally chose to do so. Linda lowered her eyes before continuing. "I owe you more than an apology." Her voice cracked as emotion caught up with months of certainty. "When your father died, I convinced myself that I understood everything. I never asked questions. I never spoke to Daniel. I never checked a single document. I just assumed the house belonged to me because I was his wife. Instead of slowing down, I acted like I had every answer." She paused, struggling to continue. "Then I handed you that lease. I made you pay me rent in your own home." The final sentence barely escaped her lips. Claire could hear genuine regret in every word. It wasn't regret over being caught. It was regret born from finally seeing the consequences of her own decisions. That difference mattered more than Linda realized. Claire placed her father's coffee mug on the small table beside her chair before quietly inviting Linda to sit. Linda hesitated, almost surprised by the invitation, then slowly lowered herself onto the porch bench where Claire's father had so often sat after work. The familiar scent of old cedar filled the evening air. For a while, neither woman spoke. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children laughed somewhere down the street while sprinklers clicked steadily across freshly cut lawns. Life continued exactly as it always had, unaware that one family's future was quietly being rewritten on a front porch. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "I never wanted this to become a fight." Linda nodded immediately. "I know that now." Claire looked toward the backyard where her father had once planted fruit trees with his own hands. "After Dad passed away, I didn't care about ownership. I cared about losing him. The house was the last thing on my mind." Linda closed her eyes briefly, realizing she had been focused on property while Claire had been focused on grief. Claire continued speaking in the calm voice Linda had heard so many times before but never fully appreciated. "When Daniel explained everything, he told me I had every legal right to ask you to leave immediately. He said the trust was clear and the law was on my side." Linda lowered her head, expecting to hear that Claire had simply delayed the inevitable. Instead, Claire surprised her. "I told him no." Linda looked up. Claire continued, "I couldn't imagine forcing someone out of the home they had shared with my father only days after burying him. No matter what our relationship had been, I knew you were grieving too." Linda felt tears filling her eyes once again. She had spent months believing Claire remained silent because she was powerless. Now she understood Claire had remained silent because she had chosen compassion over confrontation. It was a realization that hurt far more than any legal judgment ever could. Linda reached into her folder and carefully removed every rent check receipt she had kept since the lease began. One by one, she placed them on the porch table between them. "I shouldn't have accepted any of this," she whispered. "Every dollar." Claire looked down at the stack of papers but made no move to touch them. Linda continued, "I'll repay everything. Every cent. I don't care how long it takes." Claire appreciated the sincerity, but money had never been the deepest wound. "This was never about the $1,000, she answered gently. "It was about believing that after everything my grandparents and my father built, I no longer belonged here." Linda covered her face with both hands. She finally understood that the greatest damage she had caused couldn't be measured by bank statements or canceled checks. It had been created through words spoken during the most painful chapter of Claire's life. As the evening grew darker, Claire stood and walked toward the old oak tree at the edge of the backyard. It had been planted the year she was born. Her father often joked that they had grown up together. Linda followed a few steps behind. Claire rested her hand against the rough bark before speaking again. "Dad always said this house wasn't supposed to divide the family. It was supposed to keep it together." She smiled sadly. "Somewhere along the way, we forgot that." Linda looked around the yard through tear-filled eyes. She remembered birthday parties held beneath the tree, holiday cookouts, neighborhood gatherings, and the laughter that had once echoed across the grass. She realized that she had become so focused on possessing the house that she had almost destroyed the very family it was meant to protect. After several moments, Claire turned toward Linda with a calmness that caught her completely off guard. "I've already made my decision." Linda's heart began racing. She expected Claire to explain how long she had before moving out or to describe the legal paperwork Daniel would prepare. Instead, Claire said something Linda never imagined she would hear. "I'm not going to ask you to leave today." Linda stared at her in disbelief. Claire continued before she could respond. "This will always be my home, and that won't change. But Dad loved you. Whatever happened between us doesn't erase that. I'm willing to give us one chance to rebuild this family if you're willing to be honest from this day forward." Linda could barely speak. The forgiveness being offered wasn't based on obligation or weakness. It was a choice. A choice Claire made despite every reason she had to do otherwise. In standing there beneath the tree her father had planted decades earlier, Linda realized she had just been given something far more valuable than a second chance to stay in the house. She had been given one final opportunity to become the family her husband had always hoped they could be. The weeks that followed were unlike anything either woman had expected. Forgiveness, Claire quickly discovered, wasn't a single conversation on a quiet porch. It was a decision that had to be made over and over again, especially on the difficult days when old memories resurfaced and trust still felt fragile. Linda understood that as well. She no longer walked through the house giving instructions or making plans without asking. Instead, she found herself noticing details she had ignored for years. She noticed how carefully Claire dusted the framed photographs of her grandparents every Sunday morning. She noticed the way Claire stopped for a moment before entering her father's old workshop, as though she could still hear his voice echoing inside. She noticed the fresh flowers Claire quietly placed beside her father's portrait every month on the anniversary of his passing. For the first time, Linda wasn't looking at Claire as someone competing for control of a house. She was looking at a daughter who was still learning how to live without her father. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway closet, Linda came across several storage boxes she hadn't opened since moving into the house years earlier. Curious, she carried them into the living room and carefully lifted the lids. Inside were dozens of family photographs she herself had packed away long ago while redecorating. There were pictures of Claire as a little girl sitting on her grandfather's shoulders during a 4th of July parade. Another showed her grandmother proudly standing outside the bakery that had supported the family for decades. There were handwritten birthday cards, Christmas ornaments made from construction paper, school report cards, and faded vacation photographs from summers spent driving across America in an old station wagon. Linda sat on the floor turning one photograph after another. Every picture reminded her that this family had existed long before she became part of it. Rather than feeling excluded, she began feeling something else entirely. She felt regret for believing those memories somehow threatened her place in the family. They never had. There had always been room for everyone's story. She simply hadn't understood that until now. Later that evening, Claire returned from work to find the dining room table completely covered with photographs arranged in careful rows. She stopped in the doorway, surprised. Linda looked up with a hesitant smile before holding up one of the old pictures. "I think these belong back on the walls," she said quietly. Claire walked closer, recognizing photographs she hadn't seen in years. Some had disappeared so long ago that she had assumed they were permanently lost. She picked up one picture showing her parents dancing together at a neighborhood festival shortly before her mother's illness. Another captured her father teaching her to fish when she was barely old enough to hold the rod. Claire looked toward Linda, unsure what to say. Linda answered the question before it was spoken. "I shouldn't have packed these away. I thought making the house look different would somehow make it feel more like home for me. Instead, I erased pieces of your family's history. I'm sorry." Claire gently placed the photograph back on the table. "Then let's put them back together." The next several hours passed in quiet conversation as they rehung family portraits throughout the house. Some belonged in the hallway. Others returned to the living room exactly where Claire remembered seeing them throughout her childhood. Every nail they hammered into the wall felt strangely symbolic, as though they weren't simply restoring decorations but rebuilding memories that had been displaced by misunderstanding. Occasionally Linda would ask about a face she didn't recognize, and Claire would tell stories she had never shared before. She spoke about her grandmother waking before sunrise to bake bread for the neighborhood. She laughed while describing her grandfather's habit of singing old country songs completely off-key whenever he worked in the garden. She remembered family game nights that stretched well past midnight because no one wanted the evening to end. Linda listened closely, realizing how much of Claire's life she had never truly taken the time to understand. Years of assumptions had robbed them both of conversations they should have shared long ago. A few days later, Claire received an unexpected phone call from Daniel Harper. His voice carried the same calm steadiness it always had, but there was warmth behind his words. "I wanted to check on you," he said. Claire smiled. "Things are better." Daniel paused before asking, "Better enough that I should close the file?" Claire looked around the living room where Linda was carefully polishing one of her grandmother's old picture frames. A few months earlier, that same frame had been packed away in a storage box. Now it sat once again where it had always belonged. Claire answered without hesitation. "Yes. I think Dad would want that." Daniel smiled to himself. Throughout his career, he had watched countless inheritance disputes end in bitterness, years of litigation, and families who never spoke again. This outcome was different. The law had protected Claire's rights exactly as it was designed to do, but healing had come from a decision no judge could ever order. It had come from grace offered when it wasn't required. Not everyone understood that decision. News of what had happened spread quietly among relatives and neighbors, many of whom had only heard Linda's version of events during the previous months. Some were shocked to learn Claire had owned the house all along. Others couldn't believe she had chosen not to remove Linda after everything that had happened. Several friends privately asked why she would allow someone who had treated her so unfairly to remain under the same roof. Claire always gave the same simple answer. "My grandparents built this house to protect our family, not to destroy it." She never claimed forgiveness was easy. It wasn't. There were still difficult conversations. There were still moments when painful memories resurfaced. But she refused to let resentment become the final chapter of a story her father had spent his life trying to hold together. That decision surprised many people because the world often celebrates revenge more loudly than reconciliation. Yet Claire had discovered something her father understood years earlier. Peace requires far more strength than anger ever does. Several months later, on what would have been her father's birthday, Claire and Linda prepared his favorite dinner together. The kitchen that had once been the setting for a rental agreement filled instead with laughter over forgotten recipes and small cooking mistakes. At one point Linda reached into a drawer and pulled out the very lease agreement she had demanded Claire sign after the funeral. She had kept it all that time, unable to bring herself to throw it away. Quietly, she placed it on the table between them. "I don't want this to be a reminder of the worst thing I ever did," she said softly. Claire looked at the papers for a long moment before folding them neatly. "Then let's remember it for something else." Linda looked up. Claire smiled gently. "Let's remember it as the moment that eventually forced the truth into the light." Together they fed the lease agreement into the fireplace where the pages curled slowly into ash. Neither woman celebrated watching it burn. They simply watched in silence, understanding that while paper can disappear in minutes, the lessons it leaves behind can remain for a lifetime. Years later, visitors entering the house would never guess the pain those walls had witnessed. They saw a home filled with family photographs, holiday traditions, and generations of memories carefully preserved. They saw two women welcoming neighbors for backyard barbecues, community fundraisers, and Thanksgiving dinners where everyone was made to feel at home. Few knew the remarkable story behind that peaceful household. Fewer still knew that the woman greeting guests at the front door had once demanded rent from the legal owner of the very house she was standing in. Claire never shared the story to embarrass Linda, and Linda never tried to hide it when people eventually learned the truth. Instead, she openly admitted her mistake, often telling others that assumptions are among the most expensive things a person can ever own. If I had asked one question instead of making one assumption, she would say, I could have saved us both months of pain. Stories like this resonate because they remind us that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes justice is simply the truth finally reaching the people who need to hear it most. Across America, countless families face disputes over inheritances, trusts, wills, and homes that carry generations of memories. Many of those conflicts begin exactly the same way this one did, with assumptions replacing conversations and pride replacing patience. Claire's story reminds us that legal documents matter, but so do compassion, humility, and the willingness to admit when we're wrong. Her grandparents built a house hoping it would shelter future generations. Her father spent his life protecting that promise. And in the end, the greatest inheritance Claire received wasn't the deed recorded in her name. It was the wisdom to protect her family without sacrificing her integrity. The $1,000 rent checks eventually became nothing more than old paperwork stored in a forgotten archive, but the lesson behind them continued shaping everyone who heard the story. Before assuming something belongs to you, seek the truth. Before letting pride make your decisions, remember that facts have a way of revealing themselves. And sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one demanding control. It's the one who already has it and chooses mercy instead.